A few points of context, because I think OG desperately needs them in this debate. One, note that in the majority of countries you are entitled to large government compensations if banks fail. That extends to 100,000 euros in the European Union. Most people do not get that screwed over when banks fail. Secondly, we still need an explanation from open government as to why they believe banks are more able to save themselves than the state is able to save them and bail them out. But three, to the extent to which open government wants to talk about the susceptibility to economic risk and economic downfall, note that this debate does not only happen in economically sound countries. It happens in countries that are at extreme risk of default. Note, for example, Argentina. These are countries which are far more vulnerable to external factors than banks are because they have far less flexibility in how they acquire capital. This flexibility of banks comes exactly from the fractional reserve model and the fact that banks can get money very quickly if they need it. At least they can do it more than states can. These governments are not only at risk of default, they are also less flexible. This means at the end of the day, these governments, when they fail, are what causes banks to fail in the first place. Because when governments fail, inflation goes up, wages goes down, people cannot return their loans. That is when banks crash because they do not have enough money to give back to people. That is problematic. We do believe people are going to opt into this model. We trust opening government. We think there is an anti-banks climate. We think people do not trust the banks very much. We think the government is going to try to create a climate where they're going to make people believe that government bonds are safe. But opting into this is very problematic. Let's first talk about these countries which are not economically sound. This means, rebuttal of course will be interpreted, this means that on their side, banks have to act in a more risky way. This also means that banks have to be restrictive when they issue loans. This means if you have 8 economically viable projects, only 2 or 3 are going to get the necessary loan in order to be completed, because in these countries, banks do not have the flexibility, because 50% of all their operations is necessarily forced into assets that are not liquid and assets that are extremely vulnerable to outside interferences because we are talking about extremely unstable countries. This also means that if you have savings in that bank, you are potentially fucked up because the bank cannot control what happens within the state and the bank cannot predict it. Know that states are the most susceptible to outside interferences in that way. What this means at the end of the day, to the extent to which they want to talk about housing loans and stuff like that, less people get loans on their side for houses and for projects. Less people get access to mortgages. Note in the United States of America, mortgages are the highest source of like the first capital you need for an investment in order to begin your business and similar things. Note that in these countries, to the extent to which we concede that banks can act in a risky fashion, banks are more responsible and are safer than the state. It is that frame which they have to defend if they want to win this debate. But what this also means is that on their side, you have even more capital flight from these countries. People are not going to have their savings in those banks because they do not trust their government. They're going to deposit their money in Switzerland because they believe Switzerland will not default. This means that banks have even less money and even less capability to issue loans to people who necessarily need them because the governments cannot provide those wages in order for them to break the glass ceiling and begin some kind of small or medium-sized entrepreneurship. This means that also banks have less capital and less resources to save themselves in a situation where the state is failing. This also means you have less control and more volatility on your capital market, which potentially decreases the rate of foreign direct investment because political risk assessment rises, because credit ratings go down. And essentially in these countries, in order to make them economically stable and provide people with access to goods and services and infrastructure, you necessarily need that foreign direct investment. This is what's reduced on their side. So on their metric, we win. Note that we do not have to stand for not regulating banks. We just have to stand for another actor doing it. We believe that the monetary authorities the bankers, because they have the people who are educated in this, and because that is, at the end of the day, their portfolio. We say central banks already have reserve requirements and can set reserve requirements, and they can adjust them necessarily according to what the interests of the state at that point are. That flexibility is necessary because it can adjust to the conditions we have in the status quo. We do not have to concede that we do not have regulations. We do not have to concede we do not have reserve requirements. What we do say is that they lose the flexibility in setting these requirements. Of course, government may come here and they may question, okay, what happens to more developed countries? We say this incentivizes governments to act fiscally irresponsibly because now they get loans at the expense of the private sector. Currently, governments in the private sector compete for loans, in the sense that if governments want to have loans for public investment, they are fiscally responsible. No, this is the only way they look at our investments. What they do on their side is they give the government huge access to loans regardless of how fiscally responsible the government is. What does then happen? You have Greece and Italy, which have huge short-term investments in order to boost electoral outcomes, but in the long term, these investments are not profitable and they do not grant a return. What does then happen? Then you have an economic crisis. Then people cannot return their loans. They want to save people from economic crisis. They are the ones who caused the economic crisis because banks cannot influence this. Governments can. Governments create a situation people do not have money. That's what happens. I'll take closing now before I move on.
By your logic, all financial crises have been caused by governments, not banks. Like the very types of freedom and flexibility are what led to banks investing in off-balance sheet borrowing, like the mortgage crisis.
As you exactly said in your POI right now, most financial crises were caused by governments. To the extent to which that is true, it is problematic that we allow governments to act more irresponsibly and create a situation where banks crash. We did not have a problem with banks in Greece. We had problems with the Greek government, which created huge inflation, which meant that Greek banks failed, people lost their savings. This meant they were not able anymore to sustain themselves. The banks were not able to issue loans. In order to have economic recovery, you need to be able to issue loans because that's the only access to funding in economic crisis. Give banks less flexibility, you have less of that. There are other ways to have safe deposits and reserves from banks. They're like ad deposits in central banks, which tend to be very safe. We say we can stand for all of these alternatives alongside opposition. What they need to stand for is governments which are very responsible, very susceptible, and cannot be controlled by monetary authorities which have the most expertise. Don't fall for their accents and their EPL-ness. We know the economics. Thank you very much.
I'm going to do three things in my speech. The first thing I want to do is to respond to the frame coming up from opening opposition. The second thing I want to do is demonstrate how we protect consumers. And finally, how we mitigate against financial crises. If I have time, I'll forward a new substantive claim as well. Before that, two important clarifications that I think will make this debate slightly clearer. The first thing I want to say is, in response to potential CEO detention, is that we can stop banks from portraying equity accounts as substitutable alternatives to prevailing safe accounts as well. We already do this when we stop banks from selling financial instruments as an alternative or direct alternative to standard banking policies. We think we can extend that as well. The second thing I want to keep in mind is that the info spike specifically says that the alternative is to invest in government-backed safe assets. Venezuela's bonds are not considered safe. That means we don't have to defend banks having to go into governments which are likely to default because these are just not safe assets, which is what we are required to defend according to the info slide. But I'll respond to your frame anyway, so don't get too excited. So firstly, responding to the frame coming out from opening opposition. Their claim is that this is a debate about failing governments and we need to recognize governments are likely to default. The first response I want to say is that this is not the majority of governments and therefore probably isn't where this debate takes place. I think all debates, and according to the rules, should take place in a substantive majority of countries, and I think the majority of countries are not close to default. But second, I want to engage them on their terms. Even if the government is failing, why would I suggest that banks are not better and therefore this is a wash at best in this debate? The first reason why banks are not better is because in these countries which governments are failing, they're trying to do other things rather than regulate banks. They're already trying to resuscitate various parts of the industry. I think banking regulations are the last thing they want to do. Their response is, well, we don't need to rely on governments to regulate banks. We can use central banks to do this. My first response to central banks is that presumably if they were to establish the same kind of reserve requirements using central banks, then all their arguments about how you would increase capital fluidity within these banks, allowing them to make loans whether to governments or to individual investors, is undermined as well. Because the same reserve requirements means I cannot use that same amount of money to offer the loans. So they're essentially doing our policy by saying, ooh, central banks will help them do it. I think that our policy mechanism is a little bit better because at least you can grow those effective effectively what are reserve requirements on our side, because you get returns on government bonds, whereas on your side the reserve requirements are stagnant and you don't earn any interest from those requirements. The second reason why banks are not better rebutting their frame is that they hold positions in largely unsteady financial markets anyway. Most banks hold positions, they're about 80% within their local markets, about 20% in forex. That means 80% of the markets are going to be up to the government fluctuations, which they claim is so bad on their side. If they're investing in local SMCs, which are likely to be failing if governments are on the risk of default, I don't think that banks hold a better position than governments do. The final claim I want to say is that central banks are still appointed by governments. If governments are really that pernicious and governments are really close to default, I don't think central banks and the bankers who are still trying to help governments resuscitate, by the way, are going to be way better. For all these reasons, the frame is just not relevant and at best a wash. First, why do we better protect consumers? Rachel provides two mechanisms, no response, unfortunately, from opening opposition. The first mechanism Rachel brings to you is that there are perverse incentives for banks currently to take risks to attract consumers. No, this applies to the majority of countries, and in fact, even in these failing economies, which are largely trying to get more consumers on board to ensure that banks stay afloat even during times of crisis. And that means banks have a likelihood to take more risk onto what is considered traditionally to be safe bank accounts or safe assets when people put their money into an account. I think there are two claims that arise from this. The first is actually a principal claim. The principal claim that Rachel is trying to make is very simple. It is that many people cannot effectively consent to the risks in what is perceived to be a stable account. We're commonly told in our day-to-day lives that you should put your money in a bank because that's where you can grow your assets a little bit and maybe take some of that to put into shares, which is considered to be a slightly riskier alternative where you might eventually lose that money, but you will always imagine your bank account to remain safe. And many people have that perception. And therefore, when they're putting their money in a bank, they're unconsenting to the equity usage of their money. We think now what we create is then a division, right? If you choose to put your money into an account that's inherently riskier, you can effectively do so. But you also have that option then to put your account in an account that is protected in line with what you actually consented to. But second, there is also a practical claim at hand here, because the perverse incentive for banks means they're likely to take risks that causes more a higher opportunity of failure or higher opportunity of default. I'll talk more about this later, but suffice it to say, we think that there is a practical limitation on banks when they cannot take as many risks because there needs to be a baseline number of government-backed safe assets. The second claim Rachel brings to the table is that you can cross-subsidize risk when you have at least some non-risky assets. We think that's generally a benefit that we heard once again, no response to coming from opening opposition. These two benefits means that we better protect consumers on that. And I'll chat more about this, but I want to respond to the final claim I think lies in opening opposition. The final claim that I think we hear from them that I haven't already responded to is the idea that this forces governments to be fiscally responsible. I'm unclear why governments necessarily need to borrow from local banks, and I have a few reasons for this. First, governments can easily borrow from banks abroad. If local banks are operating within failing economies, I'm unclear why these same local banks will force them to be fiscally responsible. Second, and this is actually like the status quo in most countries which are failing, they borrow just toxic debt from countries like China and Russia. I'm not sure why this forces governments to be fiscally responsible. I don't think they give us any convincing mechanism, and I don't think just this squares with reality. At the end of the day, what is the opening half way up? I think the opening half way up is fairly simple. Opening opposition essentially wants to do what we do, but with less benefits than what we do. We at least grow the base amount of reserve that we have, and that means we reduce the perverse incentive for banks, and we are able to cross-subsidize risk, which ultimately protects consumers. Before I move on, I'll take opening if they have, if not, I'll take closing.
2008 crisis happened because it transferred from North America to European Union because banks were connected. You're literally making banks more connected in terms of risk because you're making them loan from other countries.
Oh, no. We're making banks less connected because most of them in non-failing countries are going to be buying risk from their own governments. On your alternative, where banks are primarily investing in equity investments, they're going to be buying from the same big companies which they think will not fail or are too big to fail, and therefore once those companies fail, all of them will run. That's the comparative on our side. That's why we have the same effective reserve requirements as you, but at least we grow those reserve requirements. Second, how we mitigate against financial crisis. Once again, Rachel brings to you two mechanisms, no response coming from opening opposition. The first, that we reduce bank funds. It's a very simple analysis. When my savings seem to be under threat, I'd like to pull money out even if the bank's financial foundation is sound. And that's why when we have an account that is fundamentally tied to the equity investments of the bank, if these equity investments fail, I'd like to pull my money out without really assessing whether or not the bank's financial foundation is sound. The comparative on our side then is that we don't tie those accounts to equity investments. So sure, I concede, you might still see runs on the equity accounts if the equity investments start to fail, but you likely won't see runs at least on a large majority of the money which is backed by government-safe assets. So we reduce the number of bank runs, which leads to less financial crises because banks are now able to support at least failing companies and able to support themselves, which means a large majority of people's pensions are protected. The second mechanism Rachel tells you is that it's easier to resuscitate banks. The comparative is very simple. There is no control over equity positions on your side, but at least you do have control over government assets. And importantly, I think central banks, which also have the incentive to resuscitate banks because they resuscitate the economy writ large, are separated from the political incentives of governments, which on their side will be required in order to regulate